Do you have a paranormal encounter you'd like to share with us? Send us an email with your story for a chance of it being featured on Weird World. Embark on another journey through time with 4 more true and captivating TIMESLIP accounts that blur the lines between past and present. From Wes Jennings' unexpected encounter with a troop of 19th century cavalry in pursuit of Native American warriors in California, to Jeremy and Mason Powell's surreal visit to a 1950s diner, Charlie Flynn's glimpse into medieval life at Pendennis Castle, and Rachel Howard's sensory slip into Old Kyoto, where an ancient city comes to life in her apartment. Such accounts challenge our understanding of time, offering a glimpse into the unexplained phenomenon that connects us with history in profound and mysterious ways. 19th century cavalry pursuit. In the summer of 1969, 14-year-old Wes Jennings was excited to join his grandfather Joe and older brother, 17-year-old Aaron, on their annual camping and fishing trip along the Salinas River in central California. The trio set up camp at the historic Camp Roberts. One early dawn, eager to get a head start on the day's catch, Wes grabbed his rod and tackle box while his grandfather and brother still slept, and quietly headed down to the water as the morning sun peeked over the mountains. He navigated the wooded trails, reaching his favourite fishing spot about half a mile upstream, a wide, calm bend in the river, shaded by tall redwoods. As Wes cast his line out across the gentle current, he suddenly sensed something wasn't right. Though the sky had been growing steadily brighter, the sun seemed to be behind him rather than across the water, as if beginning to set. An intense chill also came over him, despite the summer heat that had him sweating just moments before. Fighting a swell of panic, Wes lowered himself to the rocky shore, closed his eyes, and prayed for the strange sensations to pass. Some few moments later, he heard voices approaching. Wes opened his eyes and cautiously peered through the trees. To his astonishment, he saw 6 Native American men on horseback stop at the river's edge. These men did not have the appearance of Native Americans you would see in a movie, but rather looked more like the kind you would see on a reservation as part of a traditional ceremony. Speaking in a language unknown to Wes, they pointed their spears upstream with urgency. Just then, the thunder of many hooves approached, scattering the group away in apparent alarm. Wes watched in disbelief as a troop of about 15 cavalry soldiers, dressed in 19th century uniforms reminiscent of Civil War Union attire, emerged on lathered horses, led by a commanding officer whose jacket bore gold trim and buttons. When the blue-clad cavalrymen spotted Wes, the leader trotted over, demanding if he had seen any Indians pass by. Still in shock, Wes mutely pointed his shaking hand in the direction he had seen the native men flee. Once the group galloped away, Wes nervously decided to head back to camp. Although he didn't notice when exactly the sun went back to normal, as his thoughts were too preoccupied with what had just happened, he did remember a heavy downpour began. Then, after finally subsiding and the clouds clearing, the sun was back to where it should have been across the wide river. Over breakfast, Wes's brother Aaron noticed how shaken and silent he was, but didn't press for details. Later, when they were fishing together, Wes finally recounted his terrifying experience. To his grateful surprise, Aaron didn't dismiss or ridicule his story, instead keeping a sympathetic eye on Wes for the rest of the trip. Though it stretched belief, Aaron knew his sensible younger brother had seen something unworldly that morning, even if he never understood what. Flashback to the 1950s. It was the start of 2011 when 14-year-old Jeremy Powell and his father, 48-year-old Mason Powell, set out on what was supposed to be a routine Sunday drive to the next nearest town. Often running errands for the family business, the father and son frequently explored the winding country roads in and between towns. However, on this fateful day, whilst heading home, they ended up getting lost along some unfamiliar dirt tracks. As Mason drove their old Ford pickup further into the remote farmland, looking for a familiar road to orient themselves, they spotted an old diner up ahead. Intrigued, they decided to stop to ask for directions back to the highway. As soon as Mason pulled the truck into the gravel parking lot, Jeremy noticed a handful of gleaming vintage cars parked out front. Inside, the pair was stunned to find the diner packed with people dressed in classic Sunday best attire straight out of the 1950s. An old jukebox in the corner was spinning doo-wop tunes. The lively chatter and clinking of utensils came to an abrupt halt as the diner patrons all turned to stare curiously at the oddly dressed newcomers, both wearing clothing sorely out of place amidst the vintage formal wear. Jeremy was wearing his favourite Spider-Man t-shirt, while Mason wore denim overalls and a white t-shirt. As the father and son stood frozen in the doorway, they felt a distinct sense from the crowd that they were not wanted there and should leave immediately. Mason protectively put his arm around Jeremy and led him to the counter to speak to a waitress. Her hair was tied up in a neat bun, and she wore cat-eye glasses and a pink knee-length skirt. As Mason asked her for directions back to the highway, she started referencing dirt roads, even though the entire area had been paved over since the 1970s. However, her directions otherwise made sense to Jeremy's father, referencing road names that were familiar to him. The two drove in stunned silence for over 2 hours back home, with Mason pressing the gas pedal down hard the whole way. Only when they finally pulled into their driveway did Jeremy break the tense quiet by whispering, "Did that really just happen, Dad?" Mason replied seriously, "Yes, son, I believe it did." Too shaken to talk further, it wasn't until the next evening over dinner when Mason and Jeremy finally told the full story to a sceptical Ellen, Mason's wife, and Jeremy's mother. Though initially dismissing the idea they had somehow stumbled into the past, Ellen had never seen her logical husband or practical young son so visibly unsettled. Medieval Courtyard. In 1983, 11-year-old Charlie Flynn embarked on a school field trip from his home in Cornwall, England, to visit the nearby Pendennis Castle, an imposing stone fortress perched dramatically on a peninsula overlooking the Celtic Sea. Being a bit of a rebellious kid, Charlie found the dry history lessons and structured tours being led by the tour guide deeply uninteresting. As Charlie trailed at the back of the chattering group of students making their way through the echoing medieval castle rooms, he slipped away unnoticed whilst his teacher had her back turned. Charlie then set off to do some renegade exploring of his own. Making his way up the winding stone steps of one of Pendennis Castle's towers, he arrived at the top. Down below, in the main castle courtyard, a colourful bustle of activity caught Charlie's eye. A troop of men and women dressed in full medieval period costume were engaging in some sort of historical reenactment. Enraptured, Charlie watched one man practice sword drills, while another helped ladies-in-waiting brush down horses adorned with ornate saddles and decorative cloths. He lost all track of time, taking in the fascinating scene below his perch. Charlie spent an hour or so watching the amazing spectacle before making his way back to the group, having missed both the guide's talks and the classes packed lunch. Upon returning, the teacher shouted furiously at Charlie for disappearing from the group, and, she said, for letting everyone down. When Charlie desperately tried to explain what he'd witnessed unfolding in the courtyard, the tour guide cut him off. "You selfish little liar," she spat, asserting no historical reenactments or demonstrations of any kind had been happening that day. Charlie looked helplessly around at his gathered classmates, but their sceptical, contemptuous faces made it clear they didn't believe him. Devastated, Charlie endured the lengthy scolding session before being banished to sit alone on the bus all the long way back to school. Over time, Charlie learned it was easier to keep his strange glimpse of the past to himself rather than face abuse and disbelief. But he would never forget the transporting experience of that hour hidden atop the tower, a peek into medieval life. Murmurs of Old Kyoto. At the end of 1997, Rachel Howard was living in a compact apartment in Kyoto, Japan, teaching English to students. One evening, after hours spent poring over tests, Rachel was roused by the murmur of voices in the adjoining room. She realised with surprise that it was coming from the room where she had set up her futon to sleep, which should have been empty. The voices, a man and a woman conversing in a formal register, spoke in an archaic form of Japanese that she could barely comprehend, even though she had studied Japanese for many years, both personally and at university. She also detected the earthy scent of incense blending with aromas reminiscent of newly laid tatami reed mats. Then suddenly she started to notice other sounds emanating from outside. The clip-clop of passing horses and cries of roving merchants. It was like an ambient soundscape of old Kyoto. Curious and compelled to investigate, Rachel slid open the rice paper door. But instead of intruders or actors in period garb, she found only her empty sleeping quarters, fitted with modern walls and flooring. She also checked outside the window, but the street was empty. The phantom wafting of incense and sounds of outdoor bustle had also disappeared, leaving Rachel disoriented in the stillness. A sudden wave of nausea forced her to step outside to regain composure in the night air. Rachel says she will never forget the way the woman talked, the high-pitched way that women in Japan used to speak, with a liquid fluidity like how a geisha may have. She is convinced that time does not exist in the way we think it does, and that some ghostly events are actually just moments of time overlapping. However, she is disappointed that we are yet to find objective, incontrovertible proof of this. She nevertheless finds it reassuring to know that there are other people around the world who share similar experiences.